Welcome back to Honored Madman, and today we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite lore nerd, Gideon the All-Knowing, a guy who I have admittedly slandered in the past. But that doesn't mean that I don't find him to be one of the more interesting characters in the game, because I do. Especially now as I'm looking back on the characters I didn't focus on as much in my earlier videos or my earlier playthroughs. My favorite Gideon moment is when you tell him that Mogwin and the demigod Mog are the same person. And he's like, oh, no shit. I was wondering who that Lord of Blood was. Best just leave him down there. I don't know why, but it just cracks me up because, not only is Mog there, but Mikola is there, and Gideon doesn't really seem to care all that much. It's almost like he already knew, but why would he reward you for sending? I don't know, it's just something I found a bit odd. Still my favorite Gideon moment, though. So Gideon Ofnir was one of the earlier Tarnished of the Round Table, making him quite old. Now I got this from one of the many insightful comments that's often left on my videos. The name Ofnir was often used by Odin as one of his many aliases. If you look up alternative names for Odin or names he's taken on, there's a long list, and on that list, one of them is Ofnir. But Gideon was one of the earlier Tarnished of the Round Table, possibly one of the first. I don't really know for sure, but I'm sure he was there back when Wilhelm and Vargrim were there. Now, it was during this time that Gideon decided to dedicate himself to the pursuit of knowledge, which is in itself a futile pursuit because, he's never going to have all of the knowledge. He's never going to truly be all-blowing. But damned if he isn't going to try. It was also around this time that presumably Gideon developed his fondness for ears and their use as his sort of motif. Although that might have came after he started to establish his network of spies and double agents and whatnot. I actually really like the whole ears thing. It reminds me of what the crones do in The Witcher 3. They have these peasants sacrifice their ears and they tie the ears to trees so they can sort of monitor the forest in a way that they're always watching. And it's really eerie because you could actually, see the ears, and then there's a part of a quest where a dude cuts off his ear. It's a pretty good game. Maybe I'll do some Witcher videos down the road. Now, despite viewing other people in Tarnished as a means to an end and pawns to be manipulated, Gideon did have a few friends back in the day, one of which was everybody's favorite puppet fetishist, Celavis, who, he's maybe a lot more comically treacherous compared to Gideon, but it makes sense why they'd be friends. And Dolores, the Sleeping Arrow, considered by many to be a handsome woman who dressed in the clothes of men. Now, this Ned's Declassified-esque group of friends would eventually fall apart after Dolores began to criticize Gideon's methods. And it was said that she was quite outspoken when it came to that, so, do with that what you will, but maybe she was particularly annoying with how critical she was of all of Gideon's manipulations and lies and his just overall duplicitousness. And Celavis is sitting there like, well, I'm all of these things too, and I'm happy that I have a friend who's just like me. Why are you criticizing him? To criticize him is to criticize me, and you criticizing me isn't something I like very much, so I'm just going to murder you and turn you into a puppet as sort of a sick joke. Seems kind of hilariously on brand for Celavis, especially considering how much he admires his puppets. I think Gideon, on the other hand, didn't take any issue with Dolores' criticisms. In fact, I think it's possible that he liked having a friend that would call him on his bullshit, maybe even thinking it kept him from falling too far into being a condescending twat, and that maybe he shouldn't view people only as a means to an end. But Celavis, on the other hand, fucking hated this shit, and he probably also took issue with Gideon's sort of relaxed attitude towards her criticisms. We already know Celavis is willing to be just as manipulative, if not worse, than Gideon. Just look at any point in his questline. It's not exactly hard to believe that Celavis would kidnap Dolores and turn her into a puppet because of her criticism and outspoken behavior towards the two of them. Maybe Celavis even thought that this would sort of make the problem go away and him and Gideon could go back to being a couple of manipulative twats, but this backfired and caused Gideon to part ways with Celavis forever. Something that the Carian Preceptor is still bitter about, as evidenced by him trying to still and turn Nephili into a puppet, presumably just to spite Gideon all these years later. It's also possible that Gideon wasn't super chill towards the criticism and maybe even agreed with Celovus' attempt to remove her. But if I were to speculate, I would say that that's where things soured. I think that maybe Gideon felt some type of guilt, and that when he saw Celovus had made her into a puppet, basically a living manifestation of his guilt and what he had done to his friend, I think it was a little too much for the all-knowing knight to handle, which caused him to sever ties with the creepy Carian preceptor. I imagine Gideon was pretty cool with Celovus turning people into puppets before he saw it happen to someone he actually cared about, despite her being a critic of him, which would make his apparent disgust of Celovus later by the events of the game sort of seem like a projection of his own disgust with himself. And there's always the other alternative that he didn't really feel guilty about Dolores' death and always found Celovus' puppet obsession a bit creepy. So similarly to the other theory, that's where he drew the line when he saw that Dolores had been turned into a puppet. Either way, we know that this would still be in the back of Celovus' mind by the events of the game, out of either a need to one-up his former colleague or some type of true bitterness and resentment. But yeah, that's how Celovus and Gideon's friendship fell apart. Obviously, a lot of that is just speculation based on the little bits of clues we get. All we really know is that Celovus and Gideon were once friends, but they parted ways due to Dolores. Everything else is just up to our interpretation. It's just fun to speculate. Now, at this point, Gideon was probably like, okay, no more friends. Only pawns. Or as The Rock from the Doom movie would say, I need soldiers. I don't need anything else but soldiers. You know, people to follow his orders unquestionably. Now, by the events of the game, Gideon has this undisclosed network of spies and enforcers, and just people that he manipulates into doing his dirty work. One of which is Nefeli Lu, a Badlands warrior descendant of the former Elden Lord Godfrey, or better known by his Badlands name, Horalu. Gideon also had the spy Henricus deeply undercover with the Volcano Manor cult, although that ultimately didn't end well for him. Gideon also had an unspeaking adherent enforcer named Ensha, who wore the bones of an ancient king like they were armor. At first glance, you might actually be forgiven for thinking Ensha is a puppet. I used to. I don't anymore. I think he's definitely some type of anime edgelord style guy that Gideon roped into doing his bidding. Out of all of his pawns, though, Nefeli was arguably the most valuable. Besides her obvious skill in battle, she could provide many uses to Gideon, such as becoming the heir to all of Limgrave, supplanting Godric after he dies, although that doesn't seem to be part of Gideon's plan. It just sort of illustrates her usefulness, or that at least of her heritage. So the best example of Gideon's style of ruthless manipulative pragmatism, which is a lot of big words that I think I'm using correctly, is best illustrated by his relationship with his surrogate daughter Nefeli, whom he took under his wing when she showed up in the Lands Between, following the guidance of grace. Sort of like the player, but Gideon's a lot more condescending to us when we show up. He gave her the info she needed to infiltrate Stormvale Keep and attempt to kill Godric, and even plays the act of the concerned and protective father if you happen to tell him about Celovus' plot to turn Nefeli into a puppet. Although I think this has more to do with the fact that he knows Celovus is trying to one-up him, and he'd rather deny him that pleasure. But Gideon's supposed care for his surrogate daughter all but disappears once she discovers some of his war crimes at Albinoric Village. I'm not sure if she stumbled on it all her own, or if Gideon foolishly sent her there after his omen killers and depraved perfumers failed to turn up anything, well, outside of the ruthless slaughter of the Albinorics. And what does Gideon do when Nefeli confronts him about his atrocities? He disowns her, tells her she's not cut out for this shit, which that one might be true. Now this sends the poor warrior woman into a depression, and if you tell Gideon about this, he further illustrates how he couldn't care less. She was always a pawn to be moved about the board. A valuable one, but a pawn nonetheless. But as always, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Now, when we meet Gideon upon our very first visit to the Round Table Hold, he seems like a pretty okay guy. He welcomes us, but he tells us, hey, you're just a visitor until you start earning your keep. You know, you can't just act like you're one of us until you start acting like you're one of us. Now, after the player demonstrates their usefulness by claiming a couple great runes and talking to the Two Fingers, Gideon offers a partnership since you guys both have the same goal of becoming the Elden Lord, and he's like, oh, we'll share information. I'll give you all the info I have on the demigods that I know about, and if you find anything out that I don't know, I'll reward you with one of these very, very rare sorceries or incantations. Since he's all-knowing and pretty much knows every single sorcery or incantation in the game, at least based on his boss fight. And sure enough though, if you bring him some info he doesn't have, he also exchanges some more info he wasn't previously willing to disclose, like about Mog, Melania, and Mikola. However, Gideon's overall darker nature starts to become more apparent if the player takes a trip down to the Albinauric village, where a once thriving community of homunculus now sits in ruins. All because Gideon discovered that the Albinaurics held a secret that he didn't yet possess. In this case, it was half of a medallion that granted access to the fabled Haligtree, one of the few areas across the lands between where Gideon's spy network did not reach. So when Gideon learned that the Albinaurics possessed this secret, he did the only thing that he thought reasonable, and that was to send a couple of depraved perfumers led by the second coming of the Capra demon to go annihilate the village. However, he did not get his prize. He did not find this mysterious medallion, because his keeper had disguised himself as a jar. However, he and Ensha tracked a lone Albinauric woman to a shack in Liurnia, where he questioned her on the whereabouts of this medallion and how to get to the Haligtree. When she refused to comply or said that she didn't have the medallion, which was the truth, Gideon then put down her direwolf Lobo, an act considered unforgivable by me, essentially immobilizing the young woman and preventing her from completing her extremely critical mission. You see, Latenna was sent down to Liurnia from the Haligtree to secure a thing known as the birthing droplet. This birthing droplet would then be delivered to Philia, the large Albinauric who's situated in the apostate derelict, deep in the farthest reaches of the consecrated snowfield, for the purpose of creating new Albinaurics. It appears to be their only way of adding to their number, at least now that they no longer depend on the Carians for any kind of subsistence. So when Gideon killed Lobo, he effectively doomed the Albinauric race to extinction. And you might be thinking, oh, that's fine. I mean, I don't like the Albinaurics too much. They shoot me with these ice arrows and they club me with these big wooden clubs and turn into blood spikes. And I'd be inclined to agree if it wasn't for Latenna being so helpful and being a straight-up Princess Mononoke reference. Having a pet direwolf, I gotta say I'm kind of biased in her favor. But anyway, if the player happens to track down Albus, who actually has the medallion, he gives it to him and then tells him, hey, bring this to Latenna. She needs to get back to the Haligtree so she can save us all. Which is just a dramatic way of saying save our race. And here's where we get another classic example of Gideon being duplicitous. Upon the player's return to the Round Table Hold, it's all blacked out and no one's there. And instead they're attacked by none other than Ensha, Gideon's top henchman. And after we kill Ensha and talk to Gideon about this, he says, oh, I believe Ensha kind of got ahead of himself. And then he proceeds to brush it off and continue, we can continue working together. We must find the Albinauric woman. We gotta find these secrets, man. We gotta get to it. Screw Ensha. He's crazy. Forget about him. You're my partner now. Let's get to it. And we can't really question him further about this, but it's quite obvious that Ensha getting ahead of himself kind of is evidence that Gideon wanted us removed from the start if we started to prove an issue, and that possibly down the road we may still need to be removed, and him getting ahead of himself is just Gideon's way of saying, Ensha tried to take you out before you outlived your usefulness, and that was really stupid of him. I don't know, I'm getting kind of rambly. I might have had too much tea earlier, but let's press on. Now the player keeps doing their thing, and Gideon still chills in his library reading perpetually until the Round Table Hold starts to burn. At which point he seems altogether unbothered and was like, well, this was always going to happen anyway, I'm just going to get what I need and leave, and suggests that we do the same. Now presumably in Gideon's mind this is where any form of a partnership with the player ends, since it won't be long before one of them becomes Elden Lord. However, when we finally progress through Leyndell, capital of Ash, and we show up at the foot of the Erd Tree, we're greeted by none other than Gideon, who is now claimed to have gazed into the will of Queen Marika herself, and that it's always been her intention for the Tarnished to struggle endlessly against themselves, keeping the world in its fractured state and stopping any chance of the Elden Ring from being repaired. And to this end, he declares that he's got to stop us from progressing, and he's killed rather quickly considering he isn't very strong and this is the end of the game. But let's examine it a little bit. Did Gideon always know this will of Queen Marika, or did he not learn until everything was burning and he got a chance to get really close to the Erd Tree? I personally think he didn't know all this until he showed up at the Erd Tree and attempted to peer into her will, possibly even learning that it was Marika that shattered the Elden Ring to free herself from the Golden Order, And in his mind, the only way to accomplish that was to keep the Tarnished fighting for eternity, keeping the ring from being repaired. There are also a few other alternatives to consider as to what Gideon saw when he supposedly peered into the will of Queen Marika herself. I suppose he could be lying, but then why have the whole speech prepared? It's also possible that he just didn't want to fight a god, but also didn't want to give up his chance at being Elden Lord. So he figured he would just kill anybody who showed up to be Elden Lord and just kind of keep the world in this fractured state. But if his goal were to still be Elden Lord, then wouldn't it make more sense for him to, I don't know, just sit around and wait for the Tarnished Warrior to knock off Godfrey, Radagon, and the Elden Beast and then try to assassinate them instead? To me, that seems way more up Gideon's alley. Or maybe he saw Godfrey up there mourning over the death of his son and just figured, I don't want any part of that. Some have said that maybe he saw the will of Radagon instead of Marika, but Radagon wanted the ring repaired, not destroyed. He didn't want the world to stay fractured like this. He wanted somebody else to come link the fire and perpetuate the cycle. Or maybe Gideon saw both of their wills and decided that, he wanted to side with Marika, who wanted the world to stay fractured. Now, that being Marika's goal kind of runs contrary to Blacksmith Hugh's dialogue about how Marika charged him with creating a weapon that could kill a god. So it's possible that he either misinterpreted her will, or it wasn't actually Marika that gave Hugh that order to create the god-killing weapon. Or Marika's just playing some type of 5D chess, and that Gideon is just hilariously another piece on the board. Which is a bit poetic if you think about it, considering how he is with people. And I know a lot of people think that Gideon is sort of betraying the player here, or at least some people think that. But he's actually very clear from when you guys form your so-called partnership that it's sort of like this professional courtesy thing. Like you guys are working together because you have the same goal in mind until the time comes where there can only be one of you, when it's time to be Elden Lord. And I think it was always Gideon's intention to use the player to do a lot of their dirty work for them and gain a lot of information and find out a bunch of secrets that Gideon himself wasn't able to discover or uncover, and then to kill them when they outlived their usefulness. Gideon was so cocky he probably thought it would be really easy to take out the player, since he had essentially already tricked them into doing all the work and gathering all the runes, slaying all the demigods, while he leeched away at every single secret and lore discovery that was made by the player. I mean, if you need to look any further with how Gideon is to people after they've outlived their usefulness, look at Nefeli after she discovers what he did at the Albinoric village. She becomes disgusted with him and becomes conflicted in her service to him. And what's Gideon's response? Well, to disown her, because she's gone too soft. You can't show compassion for homunculuses. They were merely obstacles in the way of our secrets. And he disowns her without a thought. The only reason he wants to keep Celavis from getting her as a puppet is to keep Celavis from getting another one-up on him after Dolores. It's not out of any kind of fatherly protection or feelings he has towards Nefeli. But yeah, as of right now, that's really all I have to say about Gideon right now. I always wanted to cover him, and now I finally have. Next up, we've got Bernal, and then the King Bulblin video. Then maybe we'll finally get that Black Noir one. Who knows? But as always, I hope you guys found this rambling mess of a video to be at least somewhat informative. And if you liked it, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like my videos in general, please consider subscribing. That would really put a smile on this face. But without further ado, let us have the outro. I've got a pretty unrelated question for my after outro question today, and that is, if you've played some of the Metal Gear Solid games, which one is your favorite? I should just do a poll in my community thing, because I was going to do one for the From Software games too, but I just wanted to get a good feel over which Metal Gear Solid games the audience likes the most. And trust me, I understand it can be very hard to decide sometimes. I don't know, fun question. See you guys next time. I also think it's one of the bigger missed opportunities in this game to not make Gideon's mace or hammer or staff or whatever it is into a catalyst. I mean, it only makes sense that he'd be able to cast spells with it. Maybe that's too beyond the mechanics of the game, but it just sort of seems like a missed opportunity. Maybe that's just me.